Chapter 5 of Trading Jeff and His Dog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Trading Jeff and His Dog by Jim Kjelgaard. Chapter 5. Dan. The boy stood about 10 feet away, near a pot-bellied wood stove behind which he probably had been hiding when Jeff came in. His clothing was rumpled, but at the same time it was fairly new, and not the faded hand-me-downs that were to be expected on 10-year-olds around Smithville. His face and hands were dirty, and straight black hair that had once been well groomed tumbled all over his head. Jeff knew a surge of pity. Never in Hill or any other country should a 10-year-old stand so. It was not right that any youngster's eyes should spark with such unbridled fury, or that any child should have complete willingness to kill that was so evident in this one. At the same time, Jeff felt something else. The youngster had control of himself, and the shotgun did not waver, but taut lips seemed ready to tremble, and tears lingered behind angry eyes. It was as though the boy had taken up burdens which were far too heavy, but which he was determined to carry, even while he longed for a friendly arm to help him and a sympathetic ear to which he might tell his story. And somehow, in spite of his anger, quality was evident within him. Jeff said gently, "Put down your gun, son. Tell me what you're doing here, with my pop's dog." Jeff was astounded. "Your pop's dog? That's him. That's Buster." Hearing the name, Pal flattened both ears and wagged his tail. He looked at the boy without going near him. Jeff tried to collect his thoughts. "I found him a long ways from here, clear over beyond Cressman." Uncertainty stole some of the boy's fury. You did?" "That's right." "Who are you?" "My name's Jeff Tarrant, and I'm a peddler. Put your gun down." "Well?" He lowered the shotgun. 2 tears broke from his eyes, and he shook them off with an angry whirl of his head. Jeff extended his hand. "Maybe you'd better let me have the gun." It isn't loaded. I didn't have any money to buy shells," Jeff said gently. "Taking a bit of a chance, weren't you? What if you pulled it on someone with a gun that was loaded?" I don't know." "This is really your dad's dog?" "I ought to know him." "He doesn't seem especially happy to see you." I only saw him twice. Last time a year ago, but it's my pop's." "Who are you, son?" "Dan Blazer." "And where's your pop?" "Dead," Dan said fiercely. "Shot by those Whitneys." He whirled so that his back was to Jeff, put both grimy hands to his eyes, and shook with sobs. Pal looked worried. Jeff strode swiftly across the floor, knelt beside the sobbing youngster, gathered him up, and sat with him on a homemade wooden chair whose back and seats were of laced buckskin. Laying his head on Jeff's shoulder, Dan sobbed unrestrainedly, and then he wriggled, turned away quickly so that Jeff could not see his face, and slid to the floor. He wiped his eyes with a handkerchief that was almost as dirty as his face. When he turned again to Jeff, he was calmer. "Cry baby," he accused himself. "Big cry baby." "Come here, Dan," Jeff said gently. "What do you want?" "To talk to you. I've seen men cry over a lot less." "Really?" The thought seemed a reassuring one. "Really. Where is your mother?" "She died when I was just a child." He spoke quietly. His mother had died so long ago that all pangs were gone. "I see. What were you doing when these Whitneys shot your pop?" "I was in Ackerton." Dan named the nearest city. Again Jeff was surprised. "What were you doing there?" Pop sent me to Jackson's school there. Said he was a hill man, but he didn't want me to be one. He said there were better things." "How did you get here?" "Walked," Dan answered matter-of-factly. "Didn't anyone try to stop you?" "A policeman did before I was out of Ackerton. I got away, and after that I walked at night." "Do you have any relatives?" "I'm the only one left in the Blazer family, and I aim to kill every danged Whitney. That way I'll be sure to get the one who got Pop." Jeff said dryly, "Nothing like being thorough. You're sure the Whitneys did get your Pop?" "They're the ones he fought most with." "But he fought with others too?" "Well, yes." "Hadn't we better do a bit of thinking before we shoot all the Whitneys?" "We? Why do you want to mix in? I've got your Pop's dog, haven't I? That gives me the right, doesn't it?" Dan looked doubtfully at Jeff. "Do you really think so?" "Certainly I think so, but let's not go off half-cocked. This is going to take a bit of figuring. We can't just wander around leaving corpses all over the woods." "What would you do?" "Find out who really shot your Pop and get him." "I never thought of that," Dan admitted. "Let's talk about it over a good meal. That sound all right?" "Great, but I'm down to cornmeal mush." "Tonight we'll have something else," Jeff decided. "I was just going into Smithville to buy grub. Do you like pork chops?" "Oh, boy!" Dan licked his lips. "But why should you buy me anything?" "If we're partners," Jeff said firmly, "we share and share alike. You can understand that. We're already sharing the cabin." Confidence and hope warmed Dan's eyes. He smiled, and Jeff reflected that was the way he should always look. Jeff?" "What's up?" "Do you think you could bring some shells for this shotgun?" "On one condition. The gun isn't to shoot at anything or anybody unless both of us know about it." "All right," Dan agreed. Pal went to the door with him. Jeff shoved the dog back, shut the door, and struck out into the gathering twilight. He shook a bewildered head. Was it a year ago, or only a few days, that he had been the footloose owner-manager working force of Tarrant Enterprises Limited? Why was he burdened now with a dog that few other people wanted, and a boy that nobody wanted very much? Why hadn't he left both where he found them and accepted just his own responsibilities? He shook his head again and murmured to himself, "Darn fool, Tarrant. Of all the pin-headed things you've ever done, these take the hand-polished railroad spike." At the same time, he knew that he couldn't have done otherwise. The dog had helped him, therefore the dog must not be abandoned. Nor could Jeff simply leave Dan to any fate that awaited him. The only man left in the Blazer family, Dan had walked all the way from Ackerton, more than 100 miles, to avenge his father. He intended to make sure he did it by shooting all the Whitneys, and he would die if he raised the gun to the first one. It was a staggering situation, and how should he, Jeff, solve it? Again Jeff gave himself over to the idea that first things must be first, and walked into Smithville. It was a small town with perhaps 400 inhabitants, and as nearly as there could be such a thing, it was a place where the outer world intruded on the hills. Smithville was about half civilized. The streets were dirt and rutted, but instead of log houses in which hill families abode, the dwellings here were frame. The Smithville Inn was largely a place for those who wished merriment in its louder forms, and there was one store. Wagons piled high with logs offered mute testimony as to the way the town's residents earned a livelihood, but there were no horses to be seen. Doubtless, with night approaching, the teamsters had stabled their draft animals. Jeff halted in front of the store, a rather large building whose front end consisted of numerous small panes of glass inserted in wooden frames. There was the legend, "Abel Tarkman, General Store," and beneath it was printed, "Post Office 2." Knowing before he did so what he would find, Jeff entered. Isolated stores such as this one catered to all the wants of many people. As a result, they had to stock a little bit of everything that was practical, and Abel Tarkman's store was no exception. Counters stretched its full length. Pails, straps, lanterns, and bits of harness were suspended from rafter beams. There was a rack of hoes, rakes, spades, and other garden tools, but no plows or harrows. This was not a farm community. Jeff saw a shelf of drugs, a vast assortment of chewing and smoking tobaccos, a whole rack of vari-calibered firearms and ammunition, a food counter, a dry goods counter, and towards the back a small cubbyhole of unpainted lumber that was labeled Post Office. Two other people, a stocky man with a badge and a woman, were in the store. Jeff stood aside while the proprietor, evidently Abel Tarkman himself, served the woman. A small, quiet man with an inoffensive manner, he wrapped the woman's purchases and looked inquiringly at Jeff. 4 pounds of pork chops, Jeff said. He ordered a dozen eggs, 2 loaves of bread, a 3-pound slab of bacon, 2 quarts of milk, a pound of coffee, a peck of potatoes, and, mindful of the youngster at the cabin, a head of lettuce and a bunch of carrots. To these purchases he added a broom, 4 panes of glass to replace those broken out of the cabin, putty with which to hold them, a lantern, a gallon of kerosene, and finally a half-dozen 8-gauge shotgun shells. "I've nothing but No. 4s in 8-gauge. They'll do, and I want to stick them in my pocket." Abel Tarkman looked doubtfully at the rest. "It's a lot to carry. Put it in gunny sacks. I'll manage." Tarkman reached beneath the counter for a gunny sack and said amiably, "Fishing?" "Loafing," Jeff answered. "Nothing strenuous." "Staying long?" "I don't know." "Where you staying?" "Blazer's cabin." Abel Tarkman's jaw tautened, and he said no more. Jeff frowned. It was as though something cold had crept between them, and why should the mention of Blazer bring that about? Without speaking any more, the storekeeper totaled Jeff's bill on a piece of brown wrapping paper, and Jeff paid in cash. Ordinarily he'd have tried to barter, but though the pack was full, he still had ideas about trading with the hill people. Shouldering 2 half-filled gunny sacks, Jeff left the store. The sun had set, but enough light remained so that he could see. Between 2 far-spaced houses and a sufficient distance from the store, Jeff took the 6 shotgun shells from one pocket and a knife from the other, and carefully he pried the wadding from each shell and poured the shot out, and just as carefully replacing the shot with tightly rolled bits of paper that he tore from his packages. He reassembled the shells, not forgetting was the fury of which Dan was capable. He had promised Jeff that he'd do no shooting on impulse, but Jeff wanted no accidents should Dan encounter a Whitney when he had the shotgun in his hands. Jeff was reassembling the last shell when, his badge shining in the day's last light, the man he had seen in the store came to and paused beside him. "Howdy." "Howdy." "My name's Ellis," the constable said. "Bill Ellis, and I'm constable here." "Jeff Tarrant." Jeff extended his hand. They shook, and Bill Ellis asked, "You said you're staying at Blazer's cabin?" "That's right." "See anything of a youngster thereabouts?" "You mean Dan Blazer?" "Yes, he's there." "Then I guess I'd better walk out with you and pick him up. Poor little Tad's all alone in the world." "No, he isn't. I'm taking care of him." Bill Ellis was suspicious. "Since when?" Jeff managed to sound more than a little astonished. "Didn't he tell you?" "All he did was walk through Smithville yesterday with a little sack over his shoulder and a shotgun big's a cannon in his arm. All he said was that he would meet somebody at the cabin. I waited this long to see if he really would." Jeff gave thanks for this bit of coincidence. I met him at the cabin, and he's all right. He's getting everything a youngster should have, though, of course, if your official duties call for so doing, you may take him. Naturally, I'll have to go with him and bring him right back, so there may be a bit of trouble. You were going to take him to an orphanage, weren't you?" "Where else?" "Ah, yes," Jeff agreed. "Where else? Splendid place, an orphanage, ideal for those with no one to whom they might turn. I got a letter from some school in Ackerton. Said the kid left there right after his dad's funeral and hasn't been seen since. Said they thought he'd come here and I should be on the watch for him." "An error," Jeff murmured. "Why don't you write to the school?" "Maybe I'd better." "Do that," Jeff urged. "How long does it take a letter to get to Ackerton and a reply back here?" "About a week." Jeff made up his mind to visit Ackerton before the week was out, and maybe Bill Ellis needn't send his letter. "I'm going to Ackerton," Jeff said. "I'll bring written confirmation from the school if you want it." "Well, if you're going there—" "Let's leave it that way," Jeff said quickly. "If you care to check in the meanwhile, you can ask Dan. Who killed his father, anyway?" "If I knew, he'd be in jail." "Haven't you any ideas?" "Sure I have. It's one of maybe 25 or 30 people." "Have you questioned them?" "How well are you acquainted around here?" "I just got in." "That explains it, then." "Explains what?" "You're not knowing why I haven't questioned 25 or 30 people." "Let me tell." Bill Ellis spoke at length of those who lived in Smithville and those who abode in the mountains surrounding it. The town dwellers, with few exceptions, were industrious people who were glad to work for the lumber company and to accept a weekly paycheck. They seldom caused trouble. Those residing in the hills were a different breed. They worked when they felt like it, which was not often, and few of them could bear the yoke of a steady job for more than 3 weeks at a time. They did for themselves and took their living from the wilderness. Of late years, with hunters and fishermen finding their way into the hills, guiding them has become a good source of income. But the only reason the hill people were willing to guide was because they usually spend all their time hunting or fishing anyway. They made their own laws, lived by their own code, and united only when outside forces threatened any part of their way of life. When they fought hard, and often for little reason. For many a year, a feud with the Whitneys on one side and the Painters on the other had raged. It had started, of all things, over a muskrat stolen from Jed Painter's trap. His own judge, jury, and executioner, Jed had shot Enos Whitney. 2 days later, Jed was found with a bullet in his head. Though everybody knew one of the Whitneys had shot him, nobody had ever proven it. And finally, with 4 Painters and 2 Whitneys dead, the remainder of the Painters left the hills. No officer had ever proven anything. One who'd gone into the hills had simply disappeared. Bill Ellis knew only that someone had shot Johnny Blazer. But who? Johnny had done well trapping, hunting medicinal roots, and guiding and boarding hunters and fishermen. There was not a man in the hills who wouldn't have liked what Johnny had, and not a man who wouldn't have quarreled with him about it. But to go into the hills with wholesale accusations would do nothing except rouse fury. Accusing, or even suspecting, whoever had not shot Johnny would be insult of the deadliest sort, and inevitably bring on shooting. Far from being interested in local quarrels, the outside world seldom ever heard of them, and little help could be expected from anyone. If Bill Ellis knew who had shot Johnny, he would go get him. But he had to know, and he had to have indisputable proof before he moved. He'd already done everything he could, and was no nearer a solution than he had been 2 months ago. Jeff listened intently, and realized that he was hearing the truth. If it was more extreme than what he already knew about mountain dwellers. Smithville was more isolated than any other place he had ever visited. Jeff thought of the youngster in the cabin. Dan Blazer had attended a city school, but his were hill blood and hill traditions, and he had asked no one to help him avenge his father. But vengeance was a point of honor. Jeff gritted his teeth. Dan was a child. It would be the essence of simplicity, using force if necessary, to place him in an orphanage or make him go back to school. But it would solve nothing. A boy now, Dan would be a man. And when he was, he'd be back here in the hills. There would be no forgetting. Where was Johnny found? Jeff asked. Between here and his cabin. If you noticed a big sycamore right beside the road, he was lying against the trunk. Who found him? Couple of fellows from Ackerton. They were fishing back in the mountains, and they brought Johnny here. Mike Severance, he does first aid work for the lumber company, patched him up, and they took him to Delview. He died in the hospital there. Bullet went right through him. Where is he buried? In Delview. Bill Ellis narrowed his eyes. Who are you? A peddler, Jeff answered honestly. I thought I could do some business here. You will, too. Now tell me straight why that kid came back. I told you he's with me. We'll leave it that way. The constable promised. At least until you bring word from Ackerton. But if you have any ideas except peddling, you better get some shells that are loaded with something beside paper wads. I'll think about it. Bill Ellis guessed. The kid toted the gun. Does he want the shells? That's about it. You aim to watch him? Why do you think I'm giving him blanks? Why do you bother with him? I'm an orphan myself. I could have used somebody to look after me when I was 10 years old. For Pete's sake, be careful. I'll keep that in mind. You know where to find me if you need advice, Bill Ellis promised. But if you start any half-baked ruckus, you finish it. I have a wife and 2 kids to think about. Well, maybe I'll be seeing you. Pocketing the shells and shouldering the gunny sacks, Jeff walked swiftly back up the road. He halted when he came to the big sycamore. It was a monstrous tree that shaded the road and murmured gently as the evening breeze danced through its branches. There was nothing whatever to show that a man had died violently beside it. But a man had died here, and Jeff looked quizzically at the tree. If it could talk, it probably could tell who had killed Johnny Blazer. He left the tree and hurried along. Trees did not talk, and Jeff was deep in thought until he came to the cabin. There he brushed his frowns away and forced the sparkle back into his eyes. Dan was a ticklish problem, and like all such, he had to be handled delicately. There must not even be one wrong move. Jeff burst into the cabin with a cheerful, "Poke the fire up, Dan. There's pork chops for supper." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Trading Jeff and His Dog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Trading Jeff and His Dog by Jim Kjelgaard. Chapter 6. Visitor. Sleeping in the same corner where he had slept so many times, Pal moaned softly and twitched his paws. He dreamed that things were as they had once been, and that he was hunting grouse with Johnny Blazer. Pacing ahead, Pal scented a grouse and showed Johnny where it was. There came the shotgun's blast. The dream faded, and Pal woke up. Instantly, things resumed a normal perspective. The scent of Jeff Tarrant filled the cabin, and mingled with it was the odor of Dan Blazer. Pal remembered meeting Dan before, every summer, but never for more than 10 days at a time. Johnny had brought him to the cabin for a visit. Though Pal liked all children, he saw only an incidental connection between Johnny and Dan Blazer. However, if only because Johnny had once welcomed the boy and Jeff was now welcoming him, Pal was happy to accept Dan too, and to include him in the select circle of intimates who deserved every courtesy. Next to Jeff, he would respect Dan. Though his nose told him that all was well, Pal did not go back to sleep at once. The dream had been a very vivid one, and it brought a surge of memories that was strengthened by being back at his old home. The past remained a puzzle. Pal had never understood why Johnny had disappeared. He still did not understand, and he was troubled because of it. Having a dog's instinct for time, he knew that the night was about half gone, and because he was familiar with the habits of humans, he was aware that Jeff and Dan probably would not get out of bed before sunrise. Equally at home in daylight or darkness, Pal had never known why people preferred to spend the night hours in a cabin or shelter, but he had never questioned their doing so. They were humans, he was a dog. Therefore it always befitted him to shape himself to their ways and never even think that they should bend to his. Sometimes Johnny had taken him out at night to hunt coon, and Pal rather hoped that Jeff would do the same because he liked to run at night. But it would be all right if Jeff did not. After a short time, needing contact more intimate than his nose offered, Pal rose and padded across the wooden floor. He ascended the steps, walking quietly, because experience had taught him to be quiet. Pal existed to please his master, and his whole life must be shaped to that purpose. There were no delights which, directly or indirectly, were not connected with that. When Johnny had patted his head and praised him, Pal had quivered with joy. Now he reacted in the same fashion to Jeff, and his life was a full one. He ascended the steps, walked to the bunks that Jeff and Dan occupied, sniffed gently at each, and went back to his place in the corner. He had made doubly sure that Jeff was still present, and that partially satisfied him. But because the dream and the cabin brought Johnny back to him, he was still able to sleep only fitfully. Pal recalled last night. He had been very worried when Jeff went away and left him in the cabin. Ordinarily it would have been routine, for Johnny had often left him alone. But a great fear had grown out of Johnny's death. Pal had seen him leave and been sure he'd come back, but he never had. Now he was fearful that Jeff might not return. Dan, who understood, had tried to give him comfort. "He'll come back, don't you worry. He'll come back." But Pal would not rest until Jeff's return, and then he was happy again. He wagged his tail because the two in the cabin greeted each other gladly, and he drooled at the odor of frying pork chops. Eating his share, Pal looked puzzled when Dan started to wash the dishes and Jeff began to work with the broom. In Pal's opinion, the cabin was satisfactory, and he had never understood the quirks of humans that kept them forever doing something that did not look like fun and seemed unnecessary. But Pal resigned himself to the cleaning up. He flattened his ears and retreated into a corner. He dodged from place to place whenever the broom came near, and relaxed in his own corner only when Jeff finally put the broom down and started replacing the broken window panes. Unoccupied and thought deserted, the cabin had been rifled of many things belonging to Johnny. But there were enough dishes and tableware left, for Johnny had kept a great store of it to provide for his guests. Dan yawned and Jeff sent him to bed, but the young peddler worked for a long while afterward. Finally giving Pal a pat on the head, he too sought one of the upstairs bunks. Now Pal raised his head at frequent intervals. He had a great yearning to visit again the sycamore tree, the last place where he'd seen Johnny, but the door was locked. If the customary routine was followed, it would not be opened until Jeff and Dan got up. Rising, Pal walked nervously around the cabin, sniffing at all the objects he knew so well. He went to his corner and did not leave it again until dawn's thin light turned the cabin's black windows to a pale gray. He heard a bunk creak as Jeff moved, and raised expectant ears. For a short interval there was silence, and then came Dan's sleepy voice. "You awake, Jeff?" "Nope, I'm sound asleep." Pal heard Dan giggle. There were various little noises that accompanied their getting out of bed and dressing. Tail wagging happily, Pal met them at the foot of the stairs. He went first to Jeff, who gave him a pat on the head, and then he offered his morning greeting to Dan. These ceremonies complete, he padded over to stand in front of the door. Jeff understood. "I'll let you out." Pal slipped through the open door and waited for a while in front of the cabin. This was his country, but he had not forgotten that it had rejected him. He had walked safely with Johnny Blazer, but he had been clubbed and stoned after Johnny was no longer with him. That lesson had penetrated deeply. When Pal finally left the cabin, he did not go down the path, but went at once into the brush and walked slowly. Alone, he had better be careful. He stopped when he caught the scent of a rabbit that was hiding in the brush. For a moment he was tempted to chase it, because chasing rabbits was fun. But this morning he had a more urgent mission. Still walking slowly, nose questing and ears alert, he made his way to the road and halted in some thick brush beside it. He would not expose himself on the open road until he knew what lay ahead. Across the road and up the opposite slope, a doe and fawn were feeding. Pal caught the faint odor of grouse, and he knew that a skunk had wandered that way last night. Later, a fox had minced along. The nearest human scents were those of Dan and Jeff, and as soon as he was sure of that, Pal considered himself safe. He ventured into and moved slowly down the road, but as he drew near the big sycamore, he broke into an eager trot. It was at the sycamore that he had last seen Johnny Blazer, and there that he had lost all trace of him. And now he wanted to find if there was anything he might have overlooked. He had given up all hope of finding Johnny. His long search had convinced him that his former master would never be found. But not forgotten, never to be forgotten, was his long association with Johnny, his love for him, and the good life they had lived together. Pal was going to the sycamore for the same reason that a human being rereads old letters written by a dear companion whom he will never see again. Once more he stopped to read the wind currents and the tracks in the roads. Besides the fox and skunk, only Jeff's scent remained right there. Therefore Jeff was the only human who had used the road last night. But Pal caught the fainter sense of Smithville and the people inhabiting it. They were distant odors, and no one was coming. He gave undivided attention to the sycamore. Winds had blown and rains had fallen, but Johnny Blazer had bled here, and his scent still lingered. Pal drank long and deeply of it. He made a little circle as though the scent should lead him farther. But it ended at the tree, and the dog came back to sniff again. He moaned softly in his throat, because his affection for Johnny had been great. But Johnny's scent ended where it began, at the sycamore. About to cast again, Pal halted in his tracks. The morning breeze blew directly from Smithville to him, and the breeze had told him that nobody was coming. Now that was changed. Clearly, Pal caught the scent of Pete Whitney, and he knew that Pete was walking up the road. The dog bristled, but not because he saw any connection between Pete and Johnny's disappearance. He knew only that all Whitneys were enemies, and that Pete had been near when Johnny was hurt. He crouched in the brush, undecided for the moment. If he lay perfectly still, Pete probably would pass without seeing him. But as the man drew nearer, Pal's nervousness increased. He decided suddenly that he would be safer with Jeff. Pete was just a short distance away when Pal cleared the road in one bound and raced toward the cabin. The dog knew that he had been seen, but he did not care. The one dangerous time had been the fleeting instant he needed to cross the road, and that was dangerous only because the road offered no cover. Once in the brush, he could run away from any man. He found Dan drawing water from the spring beside the cabin and slowed to a walk. Because he had run hard, he was panting. He paused very close to the boy and looked nervously back toward the road. Dan stared curiously at him. "What's down there?" he questioned. "What'd you find, Pal?" The great dog turned toward Dan and wagged his tail as evidence of good will, but his hackles remained raised as he accompanied the boy into the cabin. The good smell of frying bacon perfumed the air. Standing over the stove, Jeff looked around questioningly. "Isn't that bucket a load for you, Dan?" "Nah, I can carry it." Jeff grinned. Most boys were proud of their physical prowess, and he had not offended Dan by offering to draw the water for him. He broke eggs into the sputtering skillet. Pal growled, and Jeff turned again to look. "What's ailing him?" "I don't know. He must have smelled something he don't like. When he came up to me, he was running." Pal, knowing that Pete Whitney was coming toward the cabin, retreated to the far end of the room and stood. Still bristling, he showed his teeth. Jeff was puzzled. "What the—" "Something's around," Dan said quickly. He looked out of the window. "Jeff, Pete Whitney's coming." Eyes blazing, he looked toward the shotgun. Jeff saw and interpreted his glance. "Remember, we're not going off half-cocked." All right." Jeff opened the door and saw the man standing in front of the cabin. Pete Whitney's clothing was slipshod, but that alone did not give him the air he had. Jeff was not able to place it at once. There was something about him that should not be, something very like a surly animal. About 30, Pete had fine blond hair that seemed rooted so precariously that the slightest wind might blow it away. His unshaven cheeks were covered with stubble. Pale blue eyes shifted sidewise, and he raised a foot as though about to run. And yet, at the same time, it was as though he had no intention of running. As far as Jeff could see, he carried no firearms, but he acted as though he were armed, and doubtless he was. Mentally, Jeff compared him to the man he had met yesterday. That man had also been careless of his clothing and appearance, but there was a strength and character in his being that was not evident in Pete. Bar Whitney was strong. Pete was weak. Jeff asked pleasantly, "Something I can do for you?" "Nah." Pete spoke with a high nasal twang. "You live here?" "Since yesterday," Jeff said. "Dan and I are here together." "I swan!" Pete ejaculated. "I swan!" Jeff saw that he was obviously frightened. In spite of the fact that he seemed to be a man who would take fright easily, he might need help. "Are you in trouble?" "Nah. It's just that I was passing up the road and he blurted out, "I swan, I saw Johnny Blazer's big dog." Jeff thought swiftly. Why should seeing Johnny Blazer's dog be cause for such alarm? He asked casually, "Where'd you see him?" "Down there on the road, I swan, a haunt dog." Jeff understood and relaxed. Many of the mountain people believe firmly in haunts, spirits, and witchcraft, and everybody around Smithville had reason to believe that Pal must be dead. With an effort, Jeff concealed his amusement. A man such as this thinking Johnny Blazer's dog dead and coming suddenly upon him might tremble easily. "You did see him," Jeff said. "He's here." "He be?" For a split second, Pete's eyes lost their lackluster appearance and venom flooded them. A cold finger brushed Jeff's spine. Any man able to look like that was a dangerous one. Jeff thought of his pack and of the shotgun in its corner. And then he decided that he could handle Pete. And meanwhile there were the amenities to be observed. Had breakfast?" "Nah. Come on in and have some." Pete shuffled into the cabin, mouth taut and eyes angry. Dan backed toward Pal. The dog growled savagely. Jeff's eyes caught Dan's and he tried to flash a warning. He and Dan had a pact which included no hasty or ill-timed moves, and definitely no shooting of anyone. Jeff spoke sharply to the dog. "Stop it, Pal." Pal subsided, and Pete said nasally, "Blazer allus called him Buster." "He's Pal now." Jeff set a plate of bacon and eggs on the table and put bread and butter beside it. "You may as well start, Dan." Unable to completely erase the anger from his eyes, not speaking, Dan sat down and began to eat. Jeff put the bacon and eggs he had intended for himself on another plate. Thoughtfully, he set the plate on the other side of the table, 2 places away from the furious Dan. "Here you are, Mr. Whitney's the name, Pete Whitney." "I'm Jeff Tarrant, and this is Dan Blazer." "Yeah?" Interest leaped in Pete's eyes. "Any kin to John?" "He was my pop," Dan flared. "That you know very well." "Dan, mind your manners," Jeff remonstrated, putting more bacon and eggs in the skillet. "I'm mindin' 'em. He knows who my pop was, and he knows me." Pete, who had been eating as though finishing the meal was a job he had to complete in a great hurry, put his fork down and bent over his plate. Again Jeff thought uncomfortably of a hunted animal, and though he could not see Pete's eyes, he was sure they were once more venom-ridden. There was an awkward silence which Pete broke. "Seems to me I do mind a young'un coming to see John." Dan flared again. "Do you also mind that my pop was shot? Maybe you even know who shot him." "Dan," Jeff thundered. For a few seconds Pete lingered over his food. Then it was as though he thought out a decision which had been hard to make. He speared half an egg, curled a whole strip of bacon on the end of his fork, shoved everything into his mouth, and began to chew noisily. "Nah," he said. "I wouldn't know who'd done for John." "Dan's upset," Jeff explained. He didn't realize what he was saying. An explosive "I did too!" lingered on Dan's lips and died there when he caught Jeff's eyes. As the latter turned to lift his own breakfast out of the skillet, Pete nodded vigorously. Likely. Young'uns do get upsot. What be you doing here?" Jeff said smoothly, "We represent Tarrant Enterprises Limited and came because we thought we could do some business around Smithville." Pete's shifty eyes found Jeff's pack. "Peddler, huh? Some people call it that." "Where'd you find the dog?" "Over beyond Cressman. He made himself at home with us." Jeff put his own plate on the table and began to eat. Pete mopped up the last of his breakfast with a crust of bread, plopped it into his mouth, and licked his fingers. That done, he picked up the conversation where it had been dropped. "Take care he ain't kilt." "Take care who isn't killed?" "The dog. He turned right snarly after Blazer was kilt. Bill Ellis would have shot him if he hadn't took a mind to run away." "Did he hurt anybody?" "Nah, but he had a mind to." Pete leaned back, looking at the ceiling, cleaning his teeth with his tongue. He asked suddenly, "Where'd you get the young'un?" For a moment Jeff fumbled, but Tarrant Enterprises Limited had taught him that it was not a good idea to be at a loss long enough to let anyone think too far ahead of him. He said glibly, "Dan was farmed out to me." Jeff referred to the common practice of placing with accredited people who would support them youngsters who had no other place to turn. Dan glared. Jeff did not look at him. Pete Whitney said, "You get a smart lot of work out of 'em farmed out young'uns if you can whomp 'em to it." Jeff's next words erased Dan's glare. "Dan doesn't need whomping. We're full partners." "Ah." There was another silence, and finally Pete Whitney asked, "What you peddling?" "What do you need?" "I asked you." "Cash or swap?" "Swap." Pete looked surprised that anyone should think he had cash. "What can you swap?" Pete reached inside his shirt and drew out a knife. It was much cruder than the work of art that Jeff had from Bart Whitney, but it was sturdy, and the blade, Jeff thought wryly, was certainly keen enough to penetrate anything that Pete might have reason to stab. Since there was a buyer for everything, it stood to reason that there would be a buyer for Pete's knife. Jeff went to his pack and took out a cheap jackknife, a compass, and a wrapped parcel. He extended the knife. "I'll swap even for this." Pete accepted the knife, opened it, tried the blade on the back of his horny hand, and passed it back. "Nah, that piddlin' thin bend on rabbit fur." Enjoying himself as he always did when bartering, Jeff handed the compass over. Pete looked at it, puzzled. He glanced back at Jeff. "Do it tell the hour?" Dan laughed. Jeff explained. "It's called a compass, see? The needle always points north. Anyone who carries this can tell any direction at all." Pete was honestly astounded. "You mean they's some what can't?" "There are some, but I thought you wouldn't be one of them." He spoke admiringly, stressing the "you." Sales resistance faded to nothing if the seller, while convincing the buyer that he was much to be admired, could at the same time build up the buyer's opinion of himself. Like a good showman, Jeff had saved his masterpiece for last. He unwrapped the parcel to reveal a cheap box whose exterior was stamped with gaudy green dragons. Pete regarded it with narrowed eyes. "This," Jeff said smoothly, "I offer to very few customers. Now, if you'll just keep your eye on the box." Pete obliged, bending so closely that his face was no more than 6 inches from the box. Jeff pressed a button. The lid flew open, and a green bellows, surmounted by a grinning clown's head, sprang up to hit Pete on the nose. He leaped backward, flung himself from the table, and crouched. Again Jeff thought of an animal, but this time it was a beast of prey, and it was ready to strike. The jack that had leaped out of the box quivered on the table, swaying this way and that. Completely astounded, Pete regarded it for a moment. Then sheer delight flooded his eyes. "I swan," Jeff said proudly. "Ever see anything like that? Put it back." Jeff pressed the jack into place. Uncertainly, still a little fearful of such magic, Pete came near. He extended a hand and immediately withdrew it. "Do it again." Jeff pressed the button, and the performance was repeated. Sure now that there was nothing to fear, Pete picked the toy up and looked at it closely. He pushed the jack down, latched the cover, and pressed the button. When the clown's head flew up, he tittered nervously. "I swan. For that I must have 2 knives. Got but 1." Jeff frowned. The jack-in-the-box was a cheap trinket, and the knife was worth 4 times as much. But Pete considered the jack a very valuable object, and Jeff hoped to do much trading around Smithville. He didn't want it to be known for accepting the first thing offered, and besides, that was bad business. It took all the sport out of trading. "Have to have something to boot," he said firmly. "I got this." From his sagging pocket, Pete took a length of braided horsehide, but it had been so skillfully cured and so expertly braided that it was strong as rope and pliable as the finest cloth. It would make a wonderful bridle rein. But Jeff said hesitantly, "I don't know what I'd use it for." "For tying things." "Well..." Jeff allowed himself to be convinced. Pete sprung the jack again and again, fascinated by this simple thing which smacked of magic, because never before had he seen anything like it. And then, holding his jack-in-the-box as though it were eggshells, he made the swift transformation from fascinated child to dangerous man. "Stick to peddlin'," he said shortly, and took his leave. It was at the same time a threat and a warning, and Jeff knew it. For a moment he sat still, then got up and strolled quietly to the window. Going down the path, Pete Whitney sprung the jack, and his tittering giggle seemed again to be heard in the room. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Trading Jeff and His Dog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Trading Jeff and His Dog by Jim Kjelgaard. Chapter 7. Granny. Absorbed in watching Pete, Jeff was almost unaware when Dan came to stand beside him. As Pete disappeared, hidden by foliage, he turned away from the window and came face to face with Dan. The boy's cheeks were flushed, and hot anger burned in his eyes. Both fists were clenched so tightly that straining knuckles showed white. Jeff said quietly, "Come out of it, Dan. He's a Whitney." "Sorry you didn't shoot him?" It's not that, Jeff. I wasn't thinking very straight when I told you I aimed to shoot all the Whitneys. Why should a Whitney be in my pop's cabin? He was at our door, and he was hungry. Well, doggone it, Jeff, you talk sense." Jeff heaved an inward sigh of relief. Yesterday, Dan had not only talked of killing every Whitney, but he had acted fully capable of doing it. But yesterday he had been tired, hungry, and so terribly alone. Good food and proper rest has worked a change, but they had not made him forget why he was here. Nothing would ever do that. Dan asked, "You think we will get him, don't you?" "Get who?" "Whoever killed my pop." "Murder can't be hidden, Dan." Jeff spoke with quiet forcefulness. "If somebody really wants to find it out." "And we'll find out?" "We'll find out. Then," Dan gritted his teeth, "we'll shoot." Jeff said nothing. Dan was too young, too angry, and too steeped in the tradition of the hills to think of anything except violent vengeance. Rather than tell him he was wrong, Jeff hoped to prove it. When they found whoever had murdered Johnny Blazer, and they must find him if Dan's tangled path was ever to be straight again, the law could take over. Jeff hoped that at the right time Dan would see such a course as the proper one. For the present, the less said the better. "Let's get the place cleaned up and go out trading," Jeff suggested. "Good." Jeff washed dishes while Dan swept the floor, and it made no difference that it had also been swept last night. Only those with little regard for themselves were contented to accept dirty surroundings, and one way to keep dirt from accumulating was to clean often. Cabin in order, Jeff showed Dan his pack. Each of its numerous straps, so adjusted that they opened at the flick of a finger, gave access to one compartment, and within themselves some of the compartments were further divided. They were also of various sizes. Obviously, it was possible to carry a vast number of pins, needles, spools of thread, etc., in a somewhat small space. Kitchenware, of which Jeff had a considerable store, naturally needed more room. There was a place for bright ribbons, one for candy, and articles such as spices and tea were stored by themselves. Jeff had razor blades, pencils, an assortment of novelties such as the jack-in-the-box, a variety of small tools, nails, and both wood and metal screws. At the rear, reached by thrusting the hand through a hidden flap, were 6 more knives like the one he'd traded to Bar Whitney, meerschaum pipes, pocket watches, and a few other valuables that were best kept where they were not at once available or easily found. Jeff explained that he always planned to carry as great an assortment as possible with very few large articles. The partial bolt of gingham, the biggest single thing in the pack, he carried, not because there was much profit in carrying it, but because being able to offer gingham often provided an opening wedge to other sales. When he started, he had operated on a strictly cash basis and had earned a fair amount of money doing so. Then he had discovered a great truth which had its foundations in the complexities of human nature. No matter what the article, from aardvark whiskers to zebra tails, somebody, somewhere, not only wanted it, but wanted it badly enough to pay well. On the Atlantic coast, Jeff had picked up a box of seashells. In Indiana, he had met a trapper who had never seen any seashells, and traded them for a bundle of mink pelts. Taking the pelts to Chicago, he had sold them to a furrier for more money than he might have earned in 2 weeks peddling for cash. Though everything was precious, or at least desirable to somebody, whoever had an abundance of any kind of goods was seldom inclined to regard it highly. But though they always sell for cash, whoever offered something that they wanted, did not have, and would find it difficult to get, invariably made a better bargain. Jeff cited the knife and thong he had acquired from Pete Whitney. The jack-in-the-box had cost 15 cents, but Jeff would be able to sell the knife for at least $1.20, and he did not know how much the horsehide thong would bring. But because Pete thought the jack-in-the-box such a treasure, and never would have been able to get one for himself, he had not been cheated. Jeff concluded with the observation that peddlers had to recognize true value when they saw it. Otherwise, they would not be able to remain in business. Dan's eyes sparkled. "That sounds like fun." "It has its points," Jeff admitted. "Take me in with you for good," Dan pleaded. "I want to be a peddler, too." Jeff glanced aside. He had taken this waif under his wing and could not abandon him. And then he was struck by the happy thought that Dan's request gave him control over his charge. "We'll see." He evaded the issue. "Take me. I'll do anything if you teach me." Jeff asked quickly, "Can I count on that?" "Anything. Just ask me." "You'll do exactly as I say?" "Try it. What do you want done?" Jeff grinned. "Right now, let's go peddling and leave the shotgun here." "But you said you'd do anything." "Let's go, Jeff." With an ease born of long experience, Jeff slipped into the pack. Knowing that they were going out, Pal leaped to his feet and a doggy grin framed his jaws. Jeff closed the door but did not lock it. The cabin had been rifled only because it was thought abandoned. Known to be occupied, it was safe. The hill men might use force to get what they wanted, or even kill another man for it, but petty pilfering was beneath them. The sun was warm without being too warm, and a breeze fanned the cheeks of the pair of peddlers. The smile was complete on Jeff's face, and laughter was in his heart. The horizon stretched limitlessly with no end or definition, and good fortune was a certainty. He couldn't be other than happy. "Where are we going, Jeff?" Dan asked. "I don't know. Let's follow our noses and go where they lead." Jeff took the first mule and footpath that branched from the road, for he was sure that most of the people he wanted to see would be back in. Most hill people preferred plenty of room, and they did not, as one hillbilly had expressed it to Jeff, like to be "all cluttered up with people. Scasely a week passes but what 3-4 go by." Ranging ahead, Pal flushed a buck from its thicket, chased it a little way, and let it go. He returned to Jeff and Dan, lingered to sniff at some interesting rabbit tracks, and ran to catch up. There came a faint smell of wood smoke. Jeff sniffed eagerly, trying to determine the smoke's origin, and he thought with some amusement that he was doing exactly as he had told Dan they would do. In a very real sense, he was following his nose, and when he came to a less traveled path that swung from the one they were following, he took it. Pal at his heels, Dan bringing up the rear, he walked fast. In 3 minutes they came to a clearing. Apparently, without plan, it had been hacked out of the forest. It was irregularly shaped, probably to follow the easiest cutting, and a few large trees had been allowed to stand in it. There were many stumps, a small garden, a mule that hung its head over the topmost of 2 strands of rusting wire and looked cynical, and 4 half-wild pigs that squealed and scuttled into the brush. The barn, that had listed badly and seemed in immediate danger of falling, was propped up with saplings. The house, made of hand-hewn timbers, was very small and very old. Rains, snow, sun, and wind had so beaten it that it had achieved a unique color all its own, and somehow it looked sad. Jeff knocked confidently and waited. The door opened an inch, then another inch, and in the gloomy interior Jeff saw, not too well, a scowling face that was framed in a veritable haystack of black hair and beard. But he saw very clearly the sinister snout of a rifle that was aimed squarely at his middle, and he heard very clearly a growled, "Get going and start now." "Right away," Jeff agreed. He whirled and started back to the main path. Too overawed to speak, Dan trotted at his heels, and he dared say nothing until they were once more where they had started from. Then, "Gee!" he breathed. "Weren't you scared?" "No," Jeff answered wryly. "My heart always pounds." "Do you think he didn't want us around?" "I had a slight suspicion." "What do we do now?" "Find somebody else," Jeff said cheerfully. "It's part of peddling." The day was too fine and too sparkling to be ruined by any surly mountaineer. They walked on, feet winged and hearts gay. Jeff thought whimsically that the money he made selling or trading was the very smallest part of the reward that he received. By far the major portion lay in walks just like this, and the fact that he loved the work he was doing and trying to anticipate what lay ahead. He always tried to build up a mental picture of his next customer, always failed to do so, and invariably had to discard his carefully rehearsed approach to create a new one on the spur of the moment. Much of the time he knew the sort of house in which his next prospect would live, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the house they found not a mile from the one they had left. Rounding a bend, they saw a little hill. There was nothing majestic or imposing about it, for it was a very small hill, but it was a very beautiful one. It was as though the Creator of the mountains, after much deliberation, had decided that that little hill would fit nowhere except exactly where it was. All the trees, save one, had been stripped from the side Jeff and Dan could see, and the grass growing there was so green and soft that it was almost unreal. The one tree gave it just the right touch, so it was as though this hill was something out of fairyland. A little herd of sheep cropped the grass. Delighted, Jeff let his gaze stray upward. "Gee, but it's pretty," Dan breathed. "It is that," Jeff agreed. "Look at the house." There were trees on the very top of the hill. Silhouetted against the blue sky, they seemed to be outlined against a gentle sea. A log house nestled in the grove. Something, at first Jeff thought it must be the whitewash that outlined all the windows, and then he knew it was not, set the house apart. Like the hill, it was a fairyland house, and Jeff knew that they must visit there. The hill rose in undulating waves, with no harsh angles or uncouth lines to mar it. But it was not a park like perfection. Some person or persons must have expended enormous labor to make the hill look as it did. But every line, every patch of grass seemed to belong naturally just where it was. Jeff could decide only that this was a happy hill, and that whoever lived in the house was either the owner of a rare talent or blessed beyond belief by the angels, or perhaps some of both. They came to the house and marveled. It was made of logs and chinked with clay. but nothing haphazard had gone into its making. Even the chinking was not just slapped on and troweled in, but flowed in graceful lines as though it had always been part of the logs. As old as the cabin they had left, the house had a sheen instead of a sad and aged appearance. Whoever lived here must love it greatly. "Howdy, boys." The woman came around the house so silently and so unexpectedly that for a moment Jeff was startled. The top of her head reached scarcely to his shoulder. Her silver hair glowed like a halo, but there was something which was far from angelic in the remarkable eyes that dominated her unusual face. She wore a simple blue dress, highlighted in silver, and exquisitely stitched bluebird in flight adorned the front of it. Her movements were quick and graceful, but there was no suggestion of frailty, and the muzzle-loading rifle that swung easily from her right hand might have been a strong man's weapon. Without any hesitation, Pal went forward to receive her caress. In a sudden rush of feeling, Jeff forgot his amazement and felt entirely at home. He knew all at once that everything and everybody was welcome on this hill. "And howdy to you, Granny," he said graciously. "I'm—" Jeff thought of introducing himself as Tarrant Enterprises Limited, but did not. "I'm Jeff Tarrant, and this is Dan Blazer." Her head flitted like a bird's. "And I'm Granny Wilson." "Wilson?" Jeff remembered. "I met an Ike Wilson in Cressman." "Did you now? Ike's one of my boys. What was he doing?" "He was—" Jeff fumbled. "Darned if I haven't forgotten." Her laugh was like rippling water. "He was in jail for stealing chickens. You can say it, Jeff. It takes all kinds to make a family. My Tommy's a doctor. My Joel's a lawyer. My Billy's a sailor." She named 4 more sons, all of whom were in some useful occupation and finished. They all followed their natural bent, and Ike just naturally took to chicken stealing. She turned to Dan. "You kin to Johnny Blazer?" Dan said bashfully, "He was my pop." "Come in," she invited. "Come in and set down to gingerbread and milk. I vow I've missed Johnny, and I'm glad to have his kin. You come too, Jeff, and fetch your dog." Jeff looked at the rifle. "Have you been hunting?" "Land, no," she laughed. "I was shooting at Brand Severance." "You—" "Didn't hit him," she said. "Didn't aim to hit him. Just wanted to show him he couldn't pester my sheep. But isn't there—" She anticipated and forestalled his question. "Nope. I'm all alone. My boys, they want me to come with them. Land, I'd grow old and shrivelly in a city. 2 houses are one too many. Do come in." Granny opened the door that was made of carefully mortised, hand-polished boards and adorned with an excellent wood carving that depicted a running buck chased by wolves. Jeff and Dan breathed their delight. Except for the stove, the pots and pans that hung behind it, the lamps, and a few other articles that would be very difficult to fashion with hand tools, every bit of furniture had been made of whatever materials were available. But whoever made it had not been contented with something merely useful. Strict utility had received consideration, but beauty was in vast abundance. Jeff looked through a large window that faced the back and saw a neat garden, a little grove of fruit trees, a fat mule, a brown cow, and a cat sitting on a stone. It was exactly the big fluffy white cat that should have belonged in such a place. Not until he took a second glance did he realize that the cat was not alive at all, but woven into a tapestry. He went nearer. Stretched on a walnut frame, the tapestry was so exquisitely woven that the cat's every hair not only showed but was in the right place. The cat was about to lick a front paw, and even after he knew it was a tapestry, so real was the illusion of life that Jeff extended a hand to see if the cat might not be soft and warm. He turned to Granny. "Who did this?" She was all gentleness. "I did." That's my kitty cat, dead these 4 months." There was longing in her voice and more than a hint of sadness, and Jeff knew that the cat had meant a great deal to her. He understood. Some people loved horses, some preferred dogs, and some set their affections on cats. But for Granny, it could not be just any cat. Jeff asked, "Do you do much of this sort of thing?" "Land, yes. A body ought to keep busy." Jeff said gently, "I think you've kept busy a long while around here." 64 years the 7th of May, she said pertly. "Came as a 16-year-old bride. Enos, God rest his soul, had been gone these past 3 years. You two come into the kitchen." She led them into the kitchen, seated them, opened a trap door in the floor, took cool milk from an earthbound chamber, and lifted a tray of gingerbread from a cabinet. 80 years old, her movements were almost as brisk and sure as the girls'. Jeff and Dan ate heartily. Any food they prepared for themselves could not possibly compare with this. Granny seated herself companionably near. "Ike say when he was getting out?" she asked. "Well, no, he was there with Bucky." Jeff snapped his fingers. "I forgot his last name." "Bucky Edwards," she furnished. "Land, he and Ike been stealing chickens for a span of time." Jeff sensed something completely fine. She was old in years only. Until the day she died, her mind would be young and strong. Ike's escapades probably did hurt her, but Ike was as much her son as the doctor, the lawyer, and the others who had decided in favor of respectable careers. She would not deny him. Jeff said, "Ike and Bucky didn't seem to have any definite plans." "They have some," she assured him. "They'll come here, and when they do, there'll be a heap of trouble." She stopped suddenly as though she had said something unwise. "When do you expect them?" Jeff asked. "Don't rightly know. Maybe soon, maybe not so soon." For a moment Jeff was silent, and Dan was still stuffing gingerbread into his mouth. Granny had spoken of trouble when Ike came, but apparently it was not trouble for herself, and if she wanted him to know more about it, she would have told him. He wished he could offer her help, but he had an uncomfortable feeling that she knew how to help herself. He was trying to think of a way to steer the conversation away from Ike when Granny relieved him of the necessity for so doing. "What you peddling?" she asked brightly. Jeff fidgeted. The contents of his pack, for the most part, were designed for those who had little. Jeff tried to please people who yearned after a bit of gay ribbon, a new knife, anything they might need or desire, but could not get for themselves. But he couldn't imagine what Granny lacked, and countered her question with one of his own. "Where do you get your thread and yarn?" She looked surprised. "Spin it myself, to be sure. I have sheep. I grow flax, too." Jeff followed up because he was interested. "Do you also make your own dyes?" "Land, yes. 'Twould be a sin to let the yarbs go to waste when they grow right at the doorstep." "Do you use anything besides herbs?" "Bark, seeds, nut husks, and shells. It's all here. Take a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of another thing, seethe it, and there's a dye." "I know you do your own weaving." "Land, yes." Jeff grinned ruefully. For the first time since its founding, Tarrant Enterprises Limited had reached a blind end. Something for everyone was one of its numerous slogans, but he did not have anything for Granny Wilson, and he was honest about it. "Granny, I don't believe I can offer you a thing." "Oh, come now, you must have something." Granny reached for a skein of gray yarn. She tested it with her fingers, murmured, "Poorly, poorly," and handed it back. Granny ignored the bright ribbons, had no time whatever for the knickknacks, lingered over a packet of needles, and her eyes were accusing when she gave them back. "Young man, you are a poor shakes of a peddler." "I tried to tell you I hadn't anything you'd want." "You should have something to please a poor old woman." "I know. If I had anything good enough for you, Oh, darn! A skein of yarn tumbled out of the pack and caught on a buckle. Jeff reached through the slit for one of the many-bladed knives, opened the scissors, and carefully snipped the tangled wool off. Granny clapped joyful hands. "I knew it! I knew it! Give me that!" Jeff handed her the knife. Granny's eyes shone. "Just the thing!" she cried ecstatically. "Just what I need! My eyes ain't what they used to be. I missed 2 shots at runnin' bucks last fall, and am forever mislayin' my necessities. 'Twould be handy to have so many in one piece. Cash or swap?" Jeff said recklessly, "Let's call it a gift, Granny." But she was honestly troubled. "You can't give me aught that cost you dear." "Yes, I can." "Not by my leave," she said firmly. "It's only right that a body gets his worth." "I'll swap even for a look at some of your other tapestries." "My what?" "Your cloth pictures, like the cat." "Land! I'll get some." She bounced from her chair, bustling into an adjoining room, and they heard her open a trunk. A moment later she was back with 2 tapestries under her arm. She spread one a yard long by about 20 inches wide, and Jeff gasped. It was the Last Supper, but instead of following conventional patterns, Granny had drawn inspiration from the life around her. Jesus and his disciples were seated at a wooden table that was innocent of any adornment or finery whatsoever. But the table was so finely done that a sliver thrusting out from it seemed both real and symbolic. There was an air of dignity that rose above mere human dignity, and the dyes had been applied with a touch so delicate that holy light seemed to emanate from the picture. Its message was one of hope. Judas was not to be abandoned. "Do you like it?" Granny asked. Jeff was at a loss for words. "It's wonderful." "Preacher Skiles thinks the Lord ain't right. Preacher Skiles assumes a great deal of responsibility." She laughed. "'Twas not the way he meant it. He thinks Jesus should be sittin' above the rest, with maybe angels flyin' at his shoulder." "It's better this way." "That's what I thought," Granny asserted. "The Lord, he wasn't above the beggars, the sick, and those who done wrong. Somehow I got to think of him as comin' down to all of us." "I too." "This one," Granny spread the other tapestry, "I call The Fall of Satan." Jeff gasped again. The picture centered around the black silhouette of Satan, with the background done in delicate shades of red. There was about the figure utter misery, abandonment, and despair. The gates of hell, which he had not yet entered, were merely suggested, but they were suggested so artistically that one sensed the seething fires, the complete torment that awaited. Dan looked and shuddered. "Gee!" Jeff breathed. "Why hasn't anyone else seen these, Granny?" "Enos," she answered. "Didn't hold with hanging 'em on walls, and I've tried to keep the house as Enos wanted. But I knew Enos wouldn't mind Kitty Cat. He's company." "Somebody should see them." "Pooh! Who'd bother with an old woman's foolishness?" "I would." "Then take them. Take them for the knife." "I won't do it." She seemed crestfallen. "I didn't think you would." Jeff said seriously, "It isn't that. These are worth a great deal of money." "They are? How much?" Jeff hazarded a guess. $25. "Land. Each," Jeff finished. "My land! Granny, do you trust me?" "Pooh! I didn't raise 8 of my own without knowing aught of boys. Are these dear to you?" "I don't set much store by 'em. Enos never liked 'em." "Let me take them into Ackerton," Jeff urged. "Let me see what I can do with them there." "Go ahead if you've a mind to. Land, meal time and I haven't started a thing for you boys to eat." End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. of Trading Jeff and His Dog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Trading Jeff and His Dog by Jim Kjelgaard. Chapter 8. Ackerton. Jeff awakened an hour before sunrise. He raised himself on his bunk and listened. Dan's regular breathing proved that he still slept, and Jeff settled back beneath his warm blankets to do some thinking. In some respects, the trading around Smithville had not gone as well as he had hoped it would. The hillmen had been eager for his knives of many uses, his fishing tackle, his small tools, his nails, and all the bolts and screws he had. They had also taken all the novelties, but they had spurned his inferior products because they could make better ones themselves. And Jeff had been able to trade only one watch. Watches were useless to those who guided themselves by the sun. The women had been happy over the gay ribbons. The thread and yarn, the pins and needles, and the bolt of gingham had gone in 2 days. It was better and more colorful than anything Abel Tarkman stocked. But the women had only wanted a small portion of his kitchenware and spices. Jeff had traded all his cinnamon, pepper, tea, and a few other things that could not be found locally, but no hill woman would think of offering anything at all for what she could find growing within easy reach of her doorstep, or was able to produce in her garden. The candy had been exhausted by the 3rd day, and Jeff grinned at the way it had gone. He had conceived what he thought was the clever idea of bribing the children with it, and he had discovered that the older folks had a sweet tooth too. Never to be forgotten was Grandpa Severance sucking a striped peppermint stick with toothless jaws. However, in other respects trading had far exceeded Jeff's fondest hopes. Though the hill people had rejected some of his wares, they had been willing to pay well for what they did want. Jeff and Dan had visited their cabins or met them on the trails. For news that a peddler who'd rather trade than sell was abroad and had penetrated into the remotest valleys. Jeff had a dozen hunting knives whose quality ranged from fair to superb. There were 3 exquisitely balanced hand-made hatchets, a wonderfully polished hunting horn, a set of fine miniatures made of deer antler, a fringed buckskin shirt, 4 pairs of superior moccasins, and other articles, including an ancient matchlock pistol still in working order. Granny Wilson's tapestries remained his biggest prize. Jeff knew that beyond any doubt his week's worth had paid him more than any previous months. But he knew also that he would have to get trade goods that conformed to the hill people's idea of what they wanted. Therefore, in order to get new stock and dispose of the wares he had, a trip to Ackerton was necessary, and that presented a problem. Dan had traveled with him all week. Far from lagging, his interest in trading had heightened. So far, Dan has kept his promise and had done as Jeff said. But by the fastest route it would take a full day to go to Ackerton, a full day to return, and Jeff thought that he would need at least 4 or 5 days in that city. What would Dan do if Jeff were not there to restrain him? The boy had never forgotten that a blood feud had brought him to Smithville. Dan's bunk rustled, and he whispered, "Jeff?" "I'm here. Just wanted to see if you're awake." As it usually did when he needed it most, happy inspiration came to Jeff. "I'm awake all right, and I want you to do something for me." "Sure, Jeff." "I'm going to Ackerton today, and I may be gone a week or more. I want you to take Pal and go up to watch over Granny Wilson." "But—" "She needs somebody," Jeff urged. "You and I have stopped in there almost every day and kept an eye on her. We can't just leave her alone." Dan said reluctantly, "All right, Jeff. Can I take the shotgun?" "You just better." His problem neatly solved, Jeff relaxed. when Dan announced that he had been assigned as her protector, Granny, in her wisdom, would accept him as such. If he should get out of hand, the shotgun shells were loaded with nothing but paper. They'd make a satisfactory noise, but wouldn't hurt anybody. Jeff prepared their breakfasts. They cleaned the cabin, and with the shotgun over one shoulder, half pulling the unwilling pal with his free hand, Dan started for Granny Wilson's. Pack on his shoulder, Jeff strode into Smithville. There were 2 routes to Ackerton. The hard one was over the mountains. The easy one was 18 miles down the loggers' road to Delview, where a train could be boarded, and Jeff chose that way. He walked swiftly, anxious to make time, but even as he walked, he filed in his mind the locations of the cabins he either passed or saw evidence of. There were vast possibilities for trade around Smithville. So far he and Dan had explored only a small part of it. 12:30 brought him to Delview, and Jeff walked openly down the street. Larger than Cressman, Delview was busier, and Jeff's peddling instincts cried for expression. He submerged them. A city was the only place to offer the wares he carried now. Jeff stopped when a policeman tapped his shoulder. "Are you peddling?" "No," Jeff answered blandly. "Just passing through." "You come from Cressman?" "Cressman? I came from Smithville." "Just thought I'd ask. Been fishing?" "Hunting," Jeff said gravely. He grinned to himself and walked on. Obviously, Pop and Joe Parker had sent word to Delview, but just as obviously they told the police there to be alert for a red-headed peddler accompanied by a huge dog. On impulse, Jeff stopped at a drugstore, bought a postcard, addressed it to Joe Parker, and wrote, "Thanks for sending me to Delview. Regards to Pop. Happy days." He signed it, J. Seymour Tarrant, Esquire, dropped it into a mailbox, made his way to the station, and bought a ticket to Ackerton. Leaving Delview at 3:30 and stopping several times en route, the train did not reach Ackerton until 7:15. Jeff bore the slow ride serenely, for only the unwise thought that they must forever hurry. Besides, time could always be used to good advantage, and the slow train was a heaven-sent opportunity to work out a plan. Arriving in Ackerton, Jeff had a clear idea of just what he wanted to do there. He left the train and made a confident way through the huge station. He had the pack on his back because that was the easiest way to carry it, and he met the curious stares directed at him with a good-natured grin. He was as out of place here as a well-dressed Ackertonite would have been in Smithville, and he elicited the same curiosity. But he did not mind, because he'd been in cities before, and he would be forgotten just as soon as he was out of sight. Jeff's questing eyes found a paper banner displayed above one of the station's newsstands. "Hotel Kennard, Ackerton's Best." He glanced at the banner, followed a pointing arrow with taxi stenciled on it. Imperiously, he beckoned the lead cab and directed, "The Hotel Kennard." The cabbie looked questioningly at him. "The Kennard?" "The Kennard," Jeff repeated. "And since I know the shortest way, you might as well follow it." The cabbie shrugged. If this ill-dressed traveler wanted to go to the Kennard and was able to pay for the trip, that was his affair. Jeff relaxed in the back seat and gave himself over to enjoying the city's sights, sounds, and bustle. Maybe, if he were a very wealthy merchant instead of a peddler, he would enjoy such a place himself. A moment later, he decided that he wouldn't. Half his fun lay in personal contact with customers, and there was little that was personal about city business. The cab halted at the curb, and the driver opened the door. "Just a second," Jeff directed. He glanced swiftly at the Kennard and was satisfied. It was in one of the better sections, and the well-dressed men and women going in and out were proof enough that it was, if not the best, at least one of the best hotels. and thus Jeff had the base of operations that he wanted. He paid the cabby and entered the hotel. The lobby was plush, with thick carpeting, marble pillars, and the usual quota of those who were waiting or simply loafing in upholstered chairs. Heads rose, and Jeff winked slyly at an obviously affluent man who peered at him over the top of a paper. Embarrassed, the man ducked back beneath his paper. Jeff made his way to the desk. "First floor room with bath," he directed loftily. "I wish to be away from street noises and—" he looked critically around the lobby. "I prefer the better furnishings." The blasé clerk, who had registered all sorts of guests, but few like this, took Jeff's measure with his eye. "Those rooms are $5 a day." "My good man, I asked for a room, not advice." The clerk was still suspicious, but he was also there to rent rooms. "Yes, sir. Overnight only?" "My stay is indefinite." Jeff signed the register with a flourishing Geoffrey S. Tarrant, accepted the key, and gave his pack over to a solemn-faced bellboy who led him down a corridor. He examined the room as he entered, displayed a dollar bill, flipped a quarter, and said to the bellboy, "Bring me a city directory, will you?" "Yes, sir." The bellboy left, knocked discreetly a few minutes later, handed Jeff a bulky directory, and Jeff tipped him $1. He washed, and careless of the glances he attracted, enjoyed a good dinner in the Kennards' dining room. Then he returned to his room, belly flopped on the bed, opened the directory, laid a pencil and a sheet of paper on it, and began to run his finger down the columns. He came to Barnerson, Joseph D., dealer in antiques, 413 Grand Avenue, and wrote the information on his sheet of paper. Jeff noted 5 more dealers in antiques, 6 sporting goods stores, and 6 shops chosen at random, which, from their listings, seemed to cater to exclusive trade. That done, he referred to a city map in the same book, and drew a line through whatever did not seem to be in one of the Ackerton's better districts. The first phase of his campaign was outlined. Jeff rang for the evening papers and read until he was too sleepy to read any more. From force of habit he woke at dawn, but turned over and went back to sleep. The hill people began their day with the first light, but he was in a city now. Jeff awoke again at 8 o'clock, breakfasted, and made his way to the street. He wandered down it and entered the first clothing store he found. "I want a business suit," he told the clerk who accosted him. "This way, sir." The clerk tried to read Jeff, thought he'd succeeded, and brought out a suit that had been in style 15 years ago, and probably in storage since. Jeff rose with a curt, "Don't you have any new suits?" "Oh, sorry, sir, my error." He fitted Jeff with a neat blue serge suit, a white shirt, a modest but smart tie, a pair of socks, and new shoes. Jeff took his old clothes back to the Kennard, wrapped one of Bar Whitney's knives, thrust it into his inside coat pocket, and went out. His trap was set and scented. Now he had to see if he would catch anything. There were 4 sporting goods stores still on his list, but Jeff passed the first because its windows were dirty, and the second because it advertised a bargain sale. But the third seemed to offer what he wanted. He asked the friendly clerk who came forward, "Is Mr. Ryerson in?" "No, he isn't, but Mr. Calworth is." "May I see him?" "This way." Jeff followed the clerk down the aisle and examined the store closely as he did so. The firearms, fishing tackle, and other sporting equipment displayed on the counters was all of quality make, and he hadn't been asked for an appointment. So evidently this store catered to sportsmen able to afford the best, and at the same time it was not overly formal. The clerk ushered him into an office, and Jeff's hopes rose. "Mr. Calworth," the clerk said, "this gentleman wants to see you." "My name's Tarrant. Jeff shook Mr. Calworth's extended hand. "Jeff Tarrant. And I'd hoped you'd be kind enough to furnish me with some information." "Sit down, Mr. Tarrant." Mr. Calworth was middle-aged, and a sprinkling of gray showed in his black hair, but there was a sparkle in his eyes, an ease of movement, and calluses on his hands. Obviously, he did something besides sit at a desk, and Jeff guessed shrewdly that he was an outdoor enthusiast himself. Jeff took the proffered chair and draped himself carelessly, but not too carelessly, upon it. "I represent Tarrant Enterprises." Jeff almost added the limited, but caught himself in time. "We may wish to expand." "Are you in sporting goods?" "Partly." "And you're considering Ackerton?" "Yes and no. And that's what I hope to decide." "There's plenty of room, Mr. Tarrant." "But how much good room?" Mr. Calworth laughed. "I'll tell you frankly. There are a variety of sporting goods stores, but Ryerson and Hapley split 45% of the trade and 90% of the most desirable trade. However, there is no reason why an aggressive newcomer should not do very well." Jeff bent forward. "Is there a survey?" "Oh." Purposely arranged to do so, the knife in his pocket had slipped and thrust the front of his new coat outward. Grinning his embarrassment, Jeff took the knife from his pocket and balanced it on his knee. Mr. Calworth's eyes followed his movements. "What do you have there?" "One of our specialties." Jeff gave him the knife. "A rather exceptional piece." Mr. Calworth slipped the knife from its sheath, and his eyes warmed as he examined it. He tested the blade with his thumb and shaved a couple of hairs from the back of his hand. When he turned to Jeff, he was interested. "You specialize in this sort of thing?" "We specialize in quality," Jeff said casually. "When we sell, we like to believe that the customer receives full value." "Do you get many articles as good?" Jeff shrugged. "Look at it. Can that be mass-produced?" "No," Mr. Calworth admitted. "What is your retail price on this knife?" $20, Jeff said firmly. "When do you intend to open your branch, Mr. Tarrant?" "I'm not sure we will open it. At least, we won't until after much more extensive research." "Would you care to make Ryerson your agent until you decide definitely?" Jeff deliberated. Then, "I hadn't thought of an agency." "It can't hurt you, and it might make you some money. I'll continue to be frank. This is not something to offer an average customer, because he simply cannot afford it. But there are sportsmen who can, and they come to Ryerson's. We'll take this and any other quality merchandise you have at a 30% discount." Jeff thought of Barr's other knife, a few of the rest, the hatchets, the bridle reins, and made a swift calculation. Not all were equally valuable, but all were quality. If Ryerson paid him cash, he would more than make up for everything he had dispensed from his pack, his train fare, his expenses in Ackerton, and he would still have valuable goods. He said finally, "It should work to our mutual benefit." "May we expect some more soon?" Mr. Calworth asked. "I have a few in my sample case at the Kennard. You may have those as soon as I've time to deliver them, and more in, shall we say, 3 weeks?" "I'll send a clerk for what you have," Mr. Calworth promised, "and leave your check at the Kennard desk. Or would you prefer payment to your business headquarters?" Jeff held his breath inwardly, but answered quite casually, "It doesn't matter." "We'll leave it at the Kennard," Mr. Calworth decided. "What should the total be?" Jeff made a swift mental calculation. Bar Whitney's 2 knives for $20 each, one almost as good for $15, 2 for $10 and 3 for $5 each, Pete's horsehide thong for $4, and 3 hatchets at $5 each. That less 30%, Jeff gave the total, $76.30. Good. Jeff knew that this keen man would examine each article and see if the price was suitable. "Are you going back to the Kennard?" "I must stop in for a few minutes." "May I send someone along to pick up the rest of the things?" "Certainly." "Fine. Don't forget us, Mr. Tarrant." Jeff walked back to the Kennard with one of Ryerson's clerks, gave him the merchandise intended for him in the lobby, and got a receipt. Then he returned to his room, looked over the motley collection of knives that remained, and decided that he could sell or trade them to his advantage. But he wanted to take care of some of the other articles first, and then give special attention to Granny's tapestries. He examined the pistol and the set of miniatures. Both were unknown quantities. About a foot long, the pistol had a metal barrel and ivory handles that had faded to a soft yellow. On each handle was an elaborate boar's head. Nat Stancer, who had traded Jeff the pistol for 2 screwdrivers, had kept it in good working order. Jeff did not know how much it was worth, but certainly it would be of use only to a hill man or to someone interested in antiques. The miniatures were small, but well carved and proportioned, and all of them consisted of deer in various stages and poses. There were a doe and fawn running, a buck, a lone fawn, 3 grazing does, a resting buck, and a doe rearing. They had cost Jeff a yard each of red, blue, and yellow ribbon, but the woman who had traded them had not done the carving. The miniatures were also old, and Jeff thought they had probably been fashioned by some invalid with nothing else to do. The pistol in one side pocket and the miniatures in another, Jeff set out to visit the antique dealers whose names and addresses he had listed. With no experience in antiques, he had only a vague idea as how to go about selling his. So he took the dealers in alphabetical order, and the first name on his list was Joseph Bannerson. He entered the store, a narrow building sandwiched between 2 larger ones, and looked curiously at the objects surrounding him. Jeff recognized few and wanted none, but looking at them strengthened his own conviction that no matter what the article might be, it was desirable to somebody. Jeff turned toward the man who came to meet him. He had half expected somebody old and creaking, but this man was only about 30 and far from decrepit. "What may I do for you?" "I have an old pistol," Jeff said, "and maybe I'd sell it if I got the right price." The man smiled. "Mister, I sell antiques. I do not buy them." "You don't? Where do you get your stock, then?" The smile became a grin. "I get my merchandise in my own way. Let me see your pistol." Jeff handed it over. The man examined it closely and finally said, "They're a drug on the market. I'll give you 50 cents. "In that case, wrap up 6 for me. I'll give you $3 for 'em." "Where would I get 6? You said they're a drug on the market." "So," the man admitted, "are most other antiques. Their value depends on how badly somebody wants them. Find somebody who wants the pistol and you'll get a fair price. To somebody who doesn't want it, it isn't worth a penny." "That makes sense." "What are you going to do now?" "Find somebody who wants it." But though Jeff visited other dealers in antiques, none offered him more than $1 for the pistol, and nobody offered anything for the miniatures. It was very late when he returned to the Kennard. End of chapter 8.